The rain seemed endless that night. Heavy drops beat against the windows of Eleanor Carter's house, as if the outside world mirrored the storm she felt inside. Wearing her most modest dress and shoes worn thin from use, she looked at herself in the cracked mirror by the door. A fracture split her reflection in two, almost as if symbolizing her own life. One side full of dreams, the other shattered by reality.
They're going to notice this dress is too old,
She murmured to herself, carefully adjusting the fabric. Trevor Miller, the boyfriend she had idolized for 2 years, had insisted she accompany him to dinner at his house. "It's important that they meet you," he had said, but Eleanor wasn't sure if it was an invitation or a test she had to pass. She ran through the poorly lit neighborhood, shielding herself from the rain with an umbrella that barely worked. When she finally reached Trevor's grand white house, her heart was racing. Before she could ring the doorbell, the door swung open.
"You're wet and late."
Trevor's voice was tinged with impatience, but he didn't seem surprised. He stepped back, allowing her to enter. Eleanor tried to smile, but the cold look he gave her made her stomach churn. The inside of the house was impressive. Gleaming furniture, a pristine Persian rug, and landscape paintings hanging on the walls. The warmth of the room contrasted with the chill Eleanor felt inside. In the dining room, Trevor's family was gathered, all with controlled expressions and assessing gazes.
"So, you're Eleanor."
Trevor's mother, a woman with perfectly styled hair and a gleaming pearl necklace, spoke with a polite smile, but Eleanor could feel the frost in her words.
Yes, Mrs. Miller. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Mrs. Miller tilted her head, as if analyzing something she couldn't quite comprehend. Her eyes dropped to Eleanor's dress, and for a moment, she didn't bother to hide the slight furrow of her brows.
"Well, I hope you enjoy seafood."
Dinner began in silence, except for the sound of cutlery against porcelain plates. Eleanor tried to make conversation, but every sentence felt like a mistake.
"Trevor told us you work at a restaurant. That must be demanding."
Trevor's father looked at her with minimal interest, but his choice of words made Eleanor uneasy. She took a deep breath before answering.
Yes, it's hard work, but I'm saving up to study. I have plans to do something bigger.
There was an awkward silence at the table. Mrs. Miller smiled again, this time with clear condescension.
"How ambitious."
Trevor chuckled softly, but Eleanor felt the laughter wasn't encouraging. It was almost as if he was saying she was dreaming too big. The dinner continued with conversations that excluded Eleanor almost entirely. They talked about international trips, investments, and social events that were far removed from her reality. The feeling of inadequacy tightened in her chest, but she kept smiling, though it was fragile. When everyone finally got up, Trevor guided her to the entrance hall. He seemed tense, fidgeting with his watch as he avoided looking directly at her.
"Eleanor, can we talk for a moment?"
She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. He took a deep breath before starting.
"I need to be honest with you. My family thinks we're not compatible. And to be honest, I'm starting to think so too."
His words hit her like stones. Eleanor blinked quickly, trying to process what he was saying.
But what are you saying?
"I'm saying that maybe we should take a break. It's better for both of us."
She felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Before she could respond, Trevor opened the door, signaling that the conversation was over. Eleanor walked out of the house, the rain soaking her dress and hair again. Each drop felt heavier than before. She walked slowly along the sidewalk, fighting back the tears that burned her eyes. Her hands trembled as she held her bag against her chest, as if it were the only thing that could protect her in that moment.
I was never good enough for them, or for him. They think they can treat me like this. They'll see.
Eleanor lifted her head and kept walking. The night was still dark, but inside her, a spark of light was beginning to shine. Eleanor arrived home late, her clothes still wet from the rain, and her shoes leaving water stains on the small living room floor. Her mother was awake, sitting in the armchair by the window, with a cup of tea cooling in her hands.
"You're home late. Is everything okay, sweetheart?"
Her voice was soft, but her tone betrayed concern. Eleanor hesitated before answering, trying to hide the tremor in her voice.
Everything's fine, Mom. I just got held up at work, and the rain got me.
But her mother knew her too well to accept the answer without questioning. She set the cup down on the table and gestured to the chair beside her.
Come sit here. Tell me what happened.
Eleanor obeyed, sitting down with her gaze fixed on her hands. After a few seconds of silence, she told her everything. The dinner, the judging stares, Trevor's cold words.
They made me feel like I was nobody.
Eleanor, listen to me. You're much stronger than you think. Those people don't define who you are.
Her mother's words were filled with conviction, but Eleanor still felt the weight of rejection. She looked around the room, seeing the worn walls and old furniture that seemed to be silent witnesses to their struggles.
But how am I going to change this, Mom? It feels like I'm never going to get out of here.
Her mother smiled softly and stroked Eleanor's cheek.
You'll find a way. You always have. Trust yourself.
Later, alone in the small room she shared with boxes of clothes and old books, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She felt the weight of the future pressing down on her, as if fate were challenging her to find a way out. The next morning, before heading to work, Eleanor prepared breakfast for her mother. There wasn't much in the fridge, just a few eggs and some bread.
Here you go, Mom.
It's not much, but it's what we have.
Her mother smiled and held her hands lovingly.
Thank you, sweetheart. You're all I could ever ask for.
As Eleanor walked to work, her mother's words echoed in her mind. But even with all the emotional support, she knew she needed something more concrete to change her life. As she passed through downtown, a flyer caught her attention. Taped to the window of a community library, it announced, "Free programming course. Start building your future." Eleanor stopped, her eyes fixed on the colorful paper. It was a chance, small but real.
Build my future.
She repeated the words in a whisper. Deep in her heart, something began to ignite. That same night, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with the flyer in her hands. The words "free course" seemed promising, but they also carried an uncertainty that made her hesitate. The table was covered with unpaid bills and an old calculator, reminding her of the reality she faced daily. She read the flyer for the 5th time, searching for some detail that might convince her it was truly possible.
What if it doesn't work out?
She murmured, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of the wind outside. Her mother, who was sewing in the corner of the room, looked at her over her glasses.
What won't work out, sweetheart?
Eleanor held up the flyer, hesitant to explain.
This programming course. It seems like a good idea, but it's so different from anything I've ever done.
Her mother set the sewing aside and walked to the table, sitting next to Eleanor.
Different doesn't mean impossible. Remember when you learned to ride a bike? You fell, you got hurt, but you never gave up.
Eleanor chuckled softly, remembering how her mother had helped her up every time she fell.
But this is much bigger than riding a bike, Mom.
Maybe it is, but you've always faced big things with courage. Don't let fear stop you now.
Her mother's words warmed something inside Eleanor. She held the flyer more firmly, as if that small piece of paper were a key to a better future. The next day, Eleanor arrived at the community library where the course would take place. The building was modest, with peeling walls and an old sign hanging above the entrance. Inside, a few tables were arranged in rows, and a group of people spoke softly while waiting for the instructor. Eleanor felt out of place. Most of the people looked younger, wearing modern clothes and carrying new backpacks. She chose a seat at the back of the room and waited, nervously fiddling with her pen.
Welcome to the Introduction to Programming course. My name is Oliver, and I'll be guiding you over the next few weeks.
The instructor, a friendly-looking man with a calm voice, began explaining the basics. Eleanor tried to keep up, but she quickly realized she was behind the rest of the group. When the class ended, she left the room with a mix of exhaustion and frustration. But as she walked home, something inside her refused to give up.
I've started. Now I need to finish.
In the days that followed, Eleanor found herself torn between the programming course and her responsibilities at home. The classes were intense, requiring more focus than she had imagined. Meanwhile, her mother seemed more tired, which worried Eleanor deeply. One afternoon, arriving home after a particularly tough class, she found her mother asleep in the armchair. The sound of her uneven breathing filled Eleanor with worry.
Mom, are you feeling okay?
Her mother opened her eyes slowly, offering a faint smile.
I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired.
But Eleanor knew it was more than just tiredness. She knelt beside the armchair, holding her mother's hand tightly.
I can drop the course, Mom. I can find another job to help more at home.
Eleanor's mother squeezed her hand, with an expression of firmness she rarely showed.
No, you're not giving up, Eleanor. This course is your chance to change our lives.
Her mother's words pierced through Eleanor's hesitation. Despite all the difficulties, there was something in her tone that allowed no objections. That night, while her mother slept, Eleanor sat at the table and opened the borrowed laptop from the course. The lights flickered occasionally, and the old fan buzzed in the background, but she ignored it all. The course content was complicated. Terms like algorithm and variable were practically foreign to her. Still, with each line of code she typed, Eleanor felt she was building something. Not just a program, but a new version of herself. The next morning, she arrived at class more confident, but was immediately confronted with a challenge. The instructor announced that all students would need to present a basic project by the end of the week.
You can work on something simple, but you need to explain the concept behind the code. I want to see how you think.
Eleanor froze for a moment. She barely understood the basic concepts, let alone how to apply them. After class, while the other students discussed ideas among themselves, Eleanor stayed behind, her laptop open and her eyes fixed on the screen. Each line of code felt like a mountain to climb.
I can't do this.
She whispered to herself, frustration building up. That's when the instructor, Oliver, approached.
Are you having trouble?
Eleanor looked at him, embarrassed.
I am. I barely understand the basic concepts.
Oliver smiled encouragingly and sat next to her.
Everyone starts like this. Let's take a look at what you already know.
With patience, he reviewed the material with her, explaining each step in simple terms. For the first time, Eleanor felt that maybe she could finish the project. That night, she worked late into the night, typing and deleting code, testing ideas and failing repeatedly. But with every mistake, she learned something new. When presentation day arrived, Eleanor walked into the room with her heart racing. Each step toward her seat felt heavier than the last. Around her, the other students seemed confident, laughing and exchanging ideas, while she could barely think of anything but the code she had spent nights trying to write. Oliver, the instructor, started the class with a warm smile, but to Eleanor, his words sounded distant. She stared at the laptop in front of her, mentally repeating every line of explanation she had prepared.
Let's begin. Who would like to present first?
A few hands shot up immediately, but Eleanor's remained firmly in her lap. As the presentations progressed, she felt sweat pooling in her hands. Every project seemed more impressive than the last. Finally, Oliver called her name. Eleanor felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Slowly, she got up and walked to the front of the room, holding the laptop in her trembling hands.
Good afternoon. My project is simple, but it represents my first step in learning programming.
Her voice shook at first, but she pushed through. She explained how she had written a small program to organize a to-do list, something she imagined would be useful for her routine. As she explained the parts of the code, Eleanor began to relax. She realized that despite the flaws, she had learned more than she thought. When she finished, there was a moment of silence in the room. Then, Oliver started clapping, followed by the other students. Eleanor felt the warmth of the applause echoing in her chest.
Congratulations, Eleanor. You not only presented a functional project, but you also showed determination. That's more than many people manage to do.
As she returned to her seat, Eleanor felt a mix of relief and pride. For the first time, she believed that she might actually be able to continue with the course. That night, as she walked home, something inside her had changed. She looked up at the sky, where the storm clouds from the past days were finally dispersing, revealing a bright moon.
Maybe I can actually do this.
With a timid smile on her lips, Eleanor headed home. She knew the road would be long, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hope that she could achieve something greater. Days at the programming course began to follow a routine for Eleanor. Every morning, she walked to the community library, carrying the borrowed laptop and a growing determination. But as the lessons progressed, the content became more complicated. Eleanor started to feel like she might be venturing into territory too unfamiliar for her skills. One day, Oliver announced an exercise that was supposed to be simple, creating a basic calculator program that could add, subtract, multiply, and divide numbers. Eleanor's eyes widened as she listened to the instructions.
I want everyone to use what they've learned so far. Don't worry if it feels difficult at first. Programming is about solving problems, one step at a time.
The other students began typing immediately, sharing ideas and laughing as they discussed their approaches. Eleanor, however, stared at the blank screen. Every line of code she had learned seemed to have vanished from her mind. She tried to write something. She typed a variable here, a command there, but everything resulted in errors. The screen began to fill with failure messages Eleanor didn't know how to fix.
Why isn't this working?
She murmured to herself, biting her lower lip hard. The room seemed to shrink around her as the voices of the other students echoed, sounding more like judgmental hums than chatter. Oliver noticed Eleanor's discomfort and approached, leaning down beside her.
Is everything okay, Eleanor?
She looked at him, trying to hide the tears starting to form.
I can't do this. It feels like everyone here knows what they're doing, except me.
Oliver gave an encouraging smile and pointed at the screen.
You know, no one is born knowing how to program. We all start this way. Mistakes, confusion, frustration. But do you know the difference between those who move forward and those who give up?
What?
Persistence. Programming is about failing 1,000 times until you get it right. Let's start from the basics together.
With patience, Oliver guided Eleanor through each step of the exercise, explaining how to create variables, use mathematical operators, and structure the code. Slowly, things started to make sense. When the class ended, Eleanor hadn't finished the program yet, but for the first time, she felt that maybe she could do it.
I haven't finished yet, but I think now I understand how to start.
She said to herself as she walked home that night. Despite the exhaustion, there was a small spark of confidence growing inside her. That night, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of coffee beside her. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the fan in the corner. Her mother had already gone to bed, but Eleanor knew she had to keep working on the program. The lines of code started to take shape. She typed slowly, double or triple checking each command before moving on to the next. But even with all her caution, errors kept popping up.
Why isn't this working? Everything looks right here.
She murmured to herself, rubbing her tired eyes. The coffee had already gone cold, but she still took small sips, trying to stay awake. Hours passed as Eleanor tried different approaches, fixed errors, and tested again. Each failure felt like a reminder of her inexperience, but she refused to give up. Around 3 a.m, something changed. A small adjustment to a line of code finally made the program work. She stared at the screen in disbelief, barely able to believe what she was seeing.
It worked.
Eleanor almost screamed but held herself back to avoid waking her mother. Instead, she smiled at the screen, feeling a wave of pride wash over her. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at class with deep dark circles under her eyes, but a new kind of confidence in her stride. Oliver noticed immediately.
I see someone worked late.
Yes, but it was worth it.
She replied with a smile. During the class, while the other students were still working on the exercise, Eleanor kept tweaking her code, improving small details that made her feel like she was mastering the logic behind the program. That day, Oliver did something Eleanor didn't expect. He called everyone for a brief demonstration of their projects.
It doesn't matter if it's not perfect yet. I want to see everyone's progress.
The students began presenting their calculators, each with a different level of complexity. When it was Eleanor's turn, she took a deep breath before standing up. She demonstrated how the program performed basic calculations. Although it was a modest project compared to the others, Oliver smiled, seeing the evident dedication in every detail. After weeks of dedication and progress in the course, Eleanor began to notice subtle changes in herself. Although she still faced challenges, her confidence was growing. She now walked through the city with a laptop in her backpack, feeling like someone who finally had a plan. That afternoon, after a productive class, Eleanor decided to stop at a small cafe on her way home. It was a simple place, with wooden tables and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee. She had barely placed her order when she heard a familiar voice behind her.
Eleanor, is that you?
Her heart raced. Turning slowly, she saw Trevor standing there, holding a cup of coffee. He was well-dressed, as always, but there was something different in his expression, a mix of surprise and discomfort.
Trevor. Hello.
It's been a long time. How have you been?
There was a pause. Eleanor wasn't quite sure how to respond to that. Part of her wanted to be polite. Another part wanted to ignore him.
I'm fine. And you?
Trevor let out a small, nervous laugh before sitting down, even though he hadn't been invited.
Oh, you know how it is. Busy life. Work, traveling. But what about you? Still working at that restaurant?
His words sounded condescending, and Eleanor felt her anger begin to bubble. But instead of reacting, she took a deep breath and answered calmly.
No, actually, I started a programming course. I'm working on a project right now.
Trevor's expression changed. He seemed taken aback, as if he had never imagined Eleanor could do something like that.
Really? That's interesting.
Eleanor couldn't tell if he was being sincere or just trying to mask his discomfort. Before he could say anything else, Trevor's phone rang. He answered quickly, exchanging a few words with someone on the other end of the line. When he hung up, he stood abruptly.
I have to go. It was nice seeing you, Eleanor.
Without waiting for a response, Trevor left, leaving Eleanor alone. She stared at the table for a few seconds, trying to process the unexpected encounter. Despite the disruption he had caused, Eleanor felt something different this time. The encounter hadn't shaken her like before. Instead, she felt even more determined to move forward and prove, not to him, but to herself, that she was capable of building a new life. After the unexpected encounter with Trevor, Eleanor returned home with a mix of thoughts swirling in her mind. His words still echoed, but this time there was no pain or regret. There was only renewed determination. The next day, as she walked to class, Eleanor noticed something different. The people in familiar places seemed less oppressive. She still lived in the same city, faced the same challenges, but something inside her had changed. She thought as she looked ahead, with steady steps and the laptop weighing down her backpack. For the first time, Eleanor felt that her future wasn't just a distant dream, but something she could reach, step by step. Eleanor's internship, her first real opportunity in the programming field, didn't start as she had imagined. Though she was thrilled to have been selected, the reality of what she would have to face hit her on the very first morning. She woke up at 5 in the morning to catch the first of 2 buses that would take her to the company. The journey, which took almost 2 hours, was on overcrowded buses where Eleanor could barely find a spot to hold on. When she arrived, her hair messy from the long journey and her clothes slightly wrinkled, Eleanor immediately noticed the difference between herself and the other interns. They arrived by car or in carpools, with sleek backpacks and pristine clothes. Even so, she smiled and greeted the team with genuine enthusiasm. Eleanor knew that her skills and determination would need to speak louder than any first impression. On the first day, she had to deal with whispered comments as she grabbed her laptop.
She seems kind of out of place, don't you think?
Maybe she's just an intern because of some quota.
Eleanor heard the whispers, but pretended not to notice. Instead, she sat at her desk and began organizing her notes, determined to prove them wrong. At lunchtime, while the other interns went out together to expensive restaurants, Eleanor chose a local diner across the street. The food was simple but fit her tight budget. As she ate alone, she watched the others through the window, laughing and taking photos. For a brief moment, she felt a pang of loneliness. In the afternoon, the team leader, Marcus, gave her first task, creating a script to organize internal files. He explained the details, but soon turned his attention to another intern, leaving Eleanor to figure things out on her own. The challenge was greater than she had expected. With no one to guide her, Eleanor spent hours reviewing her notes from the course and researching solutions online. When the day ended, Eleanor still hadn't finished the task. While the other interns left together, she stayed in the office, working until the receptionist kindly informed her they needed to close. On the way home, exhausted and hungry, Eleanor felt the weight of the day on her shoulders. Yet at the same time, there was a sense of pride for having faced it all and still being willing to come back the next day. Eleanor started her second day of the internship determined to finish the task she'd been given. The commute to the office was the same, long, exhausting, 2 overcrowded buses, but she used the time to mentally review what she needed to do. Arriving at the office, Eleanor again felt the curious glances and whispers that had followed her the previous day. She tightened the strap of her backpack and kept her head high as she walked to her desk. The workday was long and hard. She couldn't solve a problem in the code. That night, on the last bus ride home, Eleanor felt the weight of failure, but something inside her still refused to give up.
Tomorrow I'll do better.
She murmured to herself, watching the city lights pass by the window. Even hurt, she knew failure was part of the journey, and it was her choice to move forward. Though she was making progress, Eleanor felt the exhaustion building up. The long commutes and sleepless nights were taking their toll, but she didn't let it show. She continued, and each day she got better, despite the difficulties. With the success accumulated in important projects and the growing trust of Marcus and the team, Eleanor began to feel she could go further. Her internship experience had revealed not only her potential, but also a new ambition, to create something entirely her own. The nights once devoted solely to learning were now divided with bold plans. By the end of her internship, Eleanor used her accumulated savings and a small community grant to register her own company. It was a modest office, with just a borrowed desk and a second-hand computer, but for her, it was a start. She developed an app, and when it was released months later, it surprised even Eleanor. Although simple, it gained attention on online forums and was downloaded by hundreds of people in the first week. In no time, she began receiving requests to expand its functionalities. Without a team or resources, Eleanor worked alone for long hours, adjusting and improving the product. Gradually, word of mouth brought more visibility. Small businesses began hiring Eleanor to develop customized tools. What had started as a modest dream was turning into something bigger. Some time passed, and the company continued to grow. Eleanor closed major contracts, hired employees, and gained prestige in her field. Eleanor was invited to speak at a technology conference. It was a prestigious event, and her presence garnered attention as an example of overcoming adversity. On stage, under the bright lights and before a packed audience, Eleanor shared her journey. She spoke about the hardships she had faced, the mistakes she had made, and the lessons she had learned along the way.
If there's one thing I've learned, it's that our limits don't define us. Only you can decide how far you can go.
The audience gave her a standing ovation when she finished. As she stepped off the stage, several young people approached her, saying they felt inspired by her story.
You've given me the courage to believe in my dreams.
Eleanor's success was firmly established, but the past still found ways to resurface. One day, while reviewing reports in her office, her assistant walked in with a concerned expression.
Miss Carter, There's a woman named Margaret Miller in the lobby. She insists on speaking with you.
The name hit her like a blow. Margaret, Trevor's mother. Eleanor felt her heart race for a moment, but her expression remained impassive. Margaret entered the office with hesitant steps. Her clothes were simple and worn, and her eyes held a fatigue Eleanor didn't remember seeing before.
Eleanor, thank you for seeing me.
Eleanor simply nodded, motioning to the chair in front of her. Margaret sat down slowly, wringing her hands tightly.
I don't know where to start. We've lost everything, Eleanor. The money, the house. Even Trevor has been out of work for months. I know Trevor made mistakes. He knows that. But he's lost, Eleanor. I don't know what else to do. Please, can you give him a chance? A job, anything. He needs this, and so do I.
Eleanor felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to refuse immediately, but another part made her reflect. It was an opportunity to act with the same disdain she had received in the past, or to be better than that.
I'll think about it. And, Margaret, know that it's only out of respect for your honesty that I'm considering this.
Margaret bowed her head, relieved, and thanked her before leaving. As the door closed, Eleanor remained seated, staring at the city view through the window. Margaret's request had left her unsettled, bringing up questions she would need to confront. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. Margaret's words echoed in her mind, blending with memories of how that family had treated her in the past. She needed clarity, and for that, she sought out the person she trusted most. Claire, her friend from the hard days at the community library. The next morning, Eleanor met Claire at a quiet cafe. They sat in a secluded corner, away from curious eyes.
All right, Eleanor, what's going on? You seem a bit distracted.
Margaret Miller showed up at my office yesterday. She's lost everything. She wants me to offer Trevor a job.
Claire raised her eyebrows, surprised.
Trevor? The Trevor who said you weren't on his level, with a family that humiliated you, broke your heart and left you in the rain, literally?
That's the one. Part of me wants to say no, but another part thinks that would be stooping to their level.
Look, no one would blame you for saying no. You have every right to protect yourself. But if you decide to help, do it because it's who you want to be, not because you think you need to prove something.
Claire's words stayed in Eleanor's mind long after they said goodbye. Walking back home, she began to realize that her decision wasn't just about Trevor or Margaret. It was about how she chose to define her own strength and character. Eleanor scheduled the meeting for Friday afternoon. She knew facing Trevor and Margaret together would test her composure, but she was determined to hear what they had to say before making a decision. Trevor and Margaret arrived on time. Margaret seemed nervous, while Trevor maintained a stiff posture, avoiding Eleanor's gaze.
Please have a seat. Let's get straight to the point.
Eleanor spoke firmly, folding her hands on the table as the two sat down. Margaret was the first to speak.
Eleanor, thank you again for seeing us. We're here because we have nowhere else to turn. Trevor lost his job, and the situation has been unsustainable.
Margaret paused, her voice thick with emotion. Trevor, however, remained silent. Eleanor looked directly at him, waiting for him to say something.
Trevor, don't you have anything to say?
I know I've made a lot of mistakes, Eleanor. Mistakes that brought me here. But I really want to change. I just need a chance to prove it.
Eleanor studied Trevor's face as he spoke, searching for signs of sincerity. She could feel the tension in the room, the weight of the words hanging over all of them. When Trevor finished, Margaret added softly,
He's being honest, Eleanor. I see it every day. He's changed, and I know he would do anything to make up for the past.
Eleanor took a deep breath, keeping her emotions in check. It wasn't easy to hear those words, especially coming from people who had underestimated her strength in the past.
I'll think about the proposal, but understand, my decision won't be based on sympathy. It will be based on what I believe is fair.
Margaret nodded, visibly relieved, while Trevor only muttered a thank you. After they left, Eleanor remained in her office, staring out at the city, her mind filled with doubts. That night, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a glass of wine in front of her and the soft sound of instrumental music in the background. Despite the peaceful setting, her mind was a whirlwind. Trevor's voice still echoed in her thoughts. "I just need a chance." She wondered if those words were genuine or just a desperate attempt at manipulation. As she reflected, she remembered how Trevor had left her years ago, with little more than an apathetic goodbye. She remembered the humiliation she had faced, the time she had been treated as if she were worthless. But then, another thought emerged. She was no longer that girl. Everything she had achieved was proof of her strength, and she knew that returning pain with revenge wouldn't erase the past. 2 days later, Eleanor asked Margaret and Trevor to return to the office. She had made her decision and knew it was important to present her terms clearly. When the two arrived, Margaret looked anxious, while Trevor kept the same reserved expression. Eleanor greeted them with a serious but composed demeanor.
After much thought, I've decided to offer an opportunity. But I want you to understand this isn't a favor. It's a test. Trevor, I'm giving you a job in an entry-level position. You'll have clear responsibilities and deadlines to meet. And if you don't deliver, I won't hesitate to let you go.
Trevor looked up at her, seeming surprised by her bluntness.
I understand. I won't let you down.
Eleanor turned to Margaret, softening her tone slightly.
Margaret, I know you want the best for him, but his success depends solely on the choices he makes from here on out.
Margaret nodded quickly, her eyes shining with gratitude. As the two left, Eleanor felt a mix of relief and resolve. She had given a chance, but on her own terms. As she looked out at the city through her office window, Eleanor knew her decision reflected not only her growth, but also her ability to balance compassion and authority. Trevor's first week at Eleanor's company was filled with tension. He worked quietly, striving to complete his tasks and avoid any unwanted attention. For Eleanor, seeing him there in the environment she had built was a strange but enlightening experience. One day, as she walked through the departments, Eleanor saw him alongside other employees, showing a side she hadn't expected. Trevor seemed genuinely interested in learning, asking questions and taking notes on everything he could. A few days later, as she reviewed a report in her office, Trevor knocked on the door. He looked nervous but determined.
I just wanted to say thank you, Eleanor. Not just for the job, but for the chance to redeem myself.
Thank yourself if you make it worthwhile. Otherwise, this will be your last chance.
Trevor nodded. For Eleanor, the conversation was a reminder that although the past was still present, she was the only one responsible for her future. Eleanor knew she needed to maintain a careful balance. Showing empathy didn't mean lowering her expectations. Trevor needed to understand that his position wasn't just charity. It was a test of character. Later that same day, Claire visited Eleanor in her office. As they talked about the company and Trevor's progress, Claire gave a playful smile.
You've been more patient with him than I expected.
I have limits, Claire. But maybe he needs this patience to truly change.
Eleanor knew her compassion had a purpose. It wasn't just about helping Trevor, but about reinforcing to herself that she could be firm and fair, even when facing the past. A month after starting at the company, Trevor mustered the courage to do something he had been putting off since day one, ask for an honest conversation with Eleanor. He knew the weight of their shared past still lingered and wanted to confront it once and for all.
Eleanor, do you have a few minutes to talk?
Sure. Come in.
I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I need to apologize. I was a jerk in the past. I not only failed you but myself. I let my pride and the influence of others blind me. I've lost a lot since then, but what hurts most is knowing I lost you.
Trevor, I'm not the same person you knew. And honestly, I don't expect you to be the same either. You're here because I believe people can change, but that change has to be proven. Words are easy. What matters is your actions.
I understand. I won't let you down.
I hope not. But, Trevor, you need to understand one thing. My confidence doesn't come from you. It comes from myself.
Trevor remained silent, absorbing her words. When he finally left, Eleanor felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't complete reconciliation, but it was a start. With her company stabilized and her influence growing, Eleanor began thinking beyond her own projects. She knew her story could inspire other women who, like her, had faced hardships and prejudice. During a meeting with her team, Eleanor introduced a new initiative, a mentorship program for young women interested in technology. The proposal was met with enthusiasm, and the team immediately began planning workshops, virtual meetings, and hands-on guidance sessions. The program launched with great success. Women of all ages, many from underprivileged communities, attended the events. Eleanor made a point to share her experiences and answer questions personally. At one of the events, a young woman named Mia caught Eleanor's attention. At just 19 years old, Mia spoke passionately about her idea to create an app that connected single mothers to local resources.
You have an amazing idea, Mia. What's stopping you from starting?
I don't have the technical knowledge or the money for it, yet.
Eleanor smiled, recognizing something familiar in Mia's determination.
If you're willing to learn and dedicate yourself, I can help. Let's turn your idea into reality.
Mia was speechless, but the sparkle in her eyes said it all. Months later, with Eleanor's guidance and the mentorship program support, Mia launched her app, which quickly gained notoriety. For Eleanor, this was more than a technical triumph. It was proof that her influence could create real change. That night, as Eleanor reflected on the program's impact, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her legacy was just beginning, but she knew she had already planted seeds that would grow far beyond her. On the 5th anniversary of her company, Eleanor organized a simple yet meaningful celebration. The event brought together colleagues, partners, and participants from her mentorship program. As she watched people laughing and chatting, she realized how much had changed since the days when she barely had enough to get by. There was a special moment that night when Claire stepped onto the makeshift stage to give a speech.
Eleanor is more than a leader or a businesswoman. She's a living inspiration of how hard work and vision can change lives, not just her own, but everyone around her.
The applause filled the room. But what touched Eleanor most was the sparkle in the eyes of the young women from the mentorship program, looking at her as if she were proof that their dreams were possible too. That night at home, Eleanor sat down with her journal, something she had kept since her earliest days of struggle. As she turned the pages, she found an old entry written on a particularly difficult night. One day, I'll prove to myself that I'm more than they believe, that I'm strong, that I'm capable. Eleanor smiled, realizing that the promise, written with tears in her eyes years ago, was now a reality. She closed the journal and looked out the window of her apartment at the city lights that had once seemed so far away. Now, Eleanor knew her legacy wasn't just what she had built, but the lives she had touched along the way. The future isn't about where we start, but about where we choose to go. If you were in Eleanor's shoes, would you have forgiven and helped someone who hurt you in the past, or would you have chosen to move on without looking back? Share your opinion in the comments. I really want to know what you think. If this story touched you, like the video, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting stories full of twists and turns. Until next time,